Tonight, we're talking vaccines. Who gets it when? How will life change? And did we in Australia back the right options? You've got so many questions. We've got medical experts standing by to give you the answers. Welcome to Q&A. Hey there, welcome to the program. Joining me tonight, he advises the federal government on infectious diseases, Dr Nick Coatsworth, Associate Director of the Monash Institute of Medical Engineering, Michelle Ananda-Rajah, Director of the Doherty Institute, Sharon Lewin, and epidemiologist and public health medicine specialist, Tony Blakely. Would you please make all of them feel welcome? Well, our first question tonight comes from Mohammed Musaidullah.
Many other countries of different economic background have started COVID vaccination program, but Australia is yet to begin. My question is, does this truly reflect the strength of national strategic capacity for dealing with COVID or similar pandemics in future?
Nick Coatsworth, why are we so far behind so many other countries?
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for the question. I don't think we are so far behind other countries where the emergency use authorisations in the United States and the UK came in early December. They are emergency use authorisations, which is different to what the Therapeutic Goods Administration is looking at the moment, which is provisional approval for vaccines to be delivered. It's a longer process. It doesn't require emergency use authorisation because we are in a very fortunate position at the moment not to have that high number of cases. So I think we've got the approval for Pfizer, we've got the approval on the way, hopefully for AstraZeneca, and then we've got our other vaccines, Novavax and the COVAX facility coming after that.
How soon do you think we'll get approval for AstraZeneca? How far off is that?
Well, the TGA is independent. I don't know if we'll get full approval or not, but what I do know is that it's likely to come before the end of February.
The federal government, though, the Prime Minister and the Health Minister have been saying since August last year that Australians will be the first in the world. Greg Hunt's described it as the front of the queue. The Prime Minister said the front of the queue. But, I mean, the numbers tell a different story. 43 million people in the US have been vaccinated, China 40 million, the UK 13 million. I understand the difference you're describing in terms of approvals, but we are not first in the queue, are we?
No, we're not first in the queue. I think that's the answer to that question. But there are certain benefits of where we are at the moment. Firstly, the TGA has got the time to do their detailed approvals process. Secondly, we've actually seen what we call post-marketing evidence. Actually, what is this vaccine or these vaccines doing in real life? And that is a fortunate position to be in for all of us around the world because we can see that these vaccines are effective in reducing severe disease and that they are safe when given to millions upon millions of people.
Are we, Michelle, fortunate to be getting it a bit later than other countries?
I think there is some merit, actually, in having a slightly delayed rollout for Australia because, you know, we are seeing some interesting data coming out from the field, particularly in South Africa, who, you know, a couple of days ago, as you know, they paused a rollout on the AstraZeneca vaccine due to the fact that in about 1,700 people, young people who are around 30 years old, the vaccine failed in terms of its efficacy. It dropped to an efficacy of 20%. And in the people who had that variant, which you've all heard about, the South African variant, it dropped even further down to 10%. And so this was enough for the government to actually, hit the pause button. But if you look at the presentation, which is available on YouTube, you can actually see that this was predictable because they had actually taken the blood of people who had been vaccinated with AstraZeneca and they had tested in a test tube against the virus and the variant strain. And they found that it lost its potency. So it was a predictable result. And I think that there's been a little bit of downplaying of the significance of this result since then. I would really like to see the TGA contact the regulators in South Africa and speak to the experts there because, you know, it's pretty seismic for a government in a country with so much death and dying to pause rollout of a vaccine. And they've pivoted to the Pfizer. They've got 20 million doses. They've also pivoted to the Johnson & Johnson. They've got about 9 million doses. So I think we do need some answers from South Africa. I think it's important in the way the TGA contacted the Norwegian regulators.
Sharon?
I think we've got to put this into perspective. The South African study had 2,000 people in it. The registration studies for most of the vaccines have had 30,000, 40,000 people. And now 150 million people have received vaccines around the world. I just want to get back to Mohammed's question, though, about why could Australia wait? And I think it's really important to emphasise Australia is in a position unlike anywhere in the world. We do not have our hospitals overwhelmed. We do not have our healthcare system overwhelmed. We hardly have any coronavirus in the country. We've virtually got no community transmission. In the UK, in the US, in Europe, people are vaccinating to save lives and rescue an absolutely overwhelmed health system. And what these vaccines do, and why they had to use emergency approval, is because they actually stop people going to hospital. Now, we're in a very different position. In fact, had we rolled out vaccines really quickly, our lives would actually be no different. We would still be quarantining visitors. We would still be pouncing on every single case and quarantining it. So I think we have had the benefit of time. We've now got 150 million people have received vaccines, which gives us enormous security and the safety. And the issue of the variants, they're going to come, vaccines mutate, so we need to be prepared for them at all times, and this is very preliminary findings from the
But have we backed the
study.
right one then? If there are questions about the AstraZeneca vaccine, Australia's future really relies on this right now. South Africa's paused the rollout of it.
Yeah, I think we've backed the right vaccines, and this is why. First of all, we need to be able to manufacture a vaccine. It gives us incredible flexibility knowing that we've got a pipeline of a vaccine, and we're one of the few countries in our region that can actually manufacture vaccines, and we can manufacture the AstraZeneca vaccine. It gives us great flexibility. Second, the goal of our vaccine program is to stop people going to hospital and stop severe disease and convert coronavirus into the common cold. That's essentially what we want to do.
That's the clear strategy. It's not herd immunity.
Herd immunity will eventually reduce the number of people infected, would be wonderful. We are not going to eradicate coronavirus. We're just not going to eradicate it. We're going to learn to live with it and change the way it behaves in populations. And both the AstraZeneca and Pfizer vaccine protect against severe disease. And finally, yes, it will greatly help if we can reduce the total number of people infected, and both of them do that at different levels. And but what will really make a difference is how effectively we can roll it out.
Michelle, do you accept that?
Look, I think that needs a little bit of qualification. Yes, I think onshore manufacturing is a real bonus for Australia. There's no question about that because supply chains are stretched right around the world. The issue, though, is that we all know CSL can also manufacture the Novavax vaccine, and that has been shown in preliminary data, admittedly, to have an efficacy of 89%. So, that does contrast with the AstraZeneca published data, which is 62, 63%. There is a significant difference between 89% and 62%. And the other thing to point out with respect to Novavax is that in South Africa, where they tested it, 15,000 people, interim findings, they found that the vaccine still retained good activity against the South African variant. So it dropped down. It went from 95% with kind of classic coronavirus down to 60%. But that is still above the threshold of 50% set by the WHO. Now, this is in contrast to the AstraZeneca, which starts as a lower baseline, 63%, and then with the variant, it's dropped below that threshold that we would regard as being acceptable. So I think the variants are in play, and I think that we need to be alive to this because the data is telling us, and this is not just Novavax, but also Johnson & Johnson, right? And AstraZeneca now, there's a clear trend that when these variants are in play, efficacy of a vaccine falls. And, we shouldn't assume that these variants are not going to, circulate amongst us, because the reality is the variants are literally knocking on our door, the doors of hotel quarantine.
Can I just
Michelle,
jump
I
in
think
for a moment?
we need to... sorry, Sharon.
You go ahead.
I mean, I just think we need to bring the audience and the community into our confidence a bit here and point out the difference between efficacy and of a vaccine and the effectiveness of a vaccine program. Michelle's statistics are absolutely correct, and you can find them quoted in the papers. But if we talk about a difference between, say, 95% efficacy for the Pfizer vaccine and 62% efficacy for the AstraZeneca vaccine, we are talking about just the development of mild to moderate symptomatic COVID-19. All of the vaccines that Australia has a stake in have been shown to prevent severe disease. And as we're looking around the world at the moment, getting more data from those 150 million people who have been vaccinated, we can see that these vaccines, including AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, Novavax, they're all preventing severe disease. Now, for the variants, I think we're actually all in furious agreement. This virus is going to mutate.
I'm not sure Michelle sees it that way.
Oh, I think we're saying the same thing. The virus is going to mutate, and we're very good at catching up to mutated viruses. We do it every year with the flu vax.
Yeah, but this is a bit different, Nick, because we're talking about an immune-naive population, right? We have no immunity whatsoever. We're literally sitting ducks. So, you know, we need to have the most efficacious vaccines, particularly in the face of these variants, which are now, you know, emerging in really high volume infectious regions. So Brazil, South Africa, the UK. And what is actually happening is, don't get too hung up on the variants. Think of what these variants are actually doing. What the variants are doing is that they're all converging, right? In an evolutionary sense, they're converging, they're acquiring mutations to their spike protein. And the things that this virus wants to do is that it wants to become more contagious and it wants to evade vaccines. And it's doing it pretty successfully. So I wouldn't be downplaying this, and this is why I think we need to be reaching for the big guns, right? We need to be pulling for the vaccines that have the highest efficacy, because all the data is showing us that when variants come into play, particularly from South Africa, right, your efficacy drops. So you want to be starting from a high baseline in order to make sure you're going to still be above that efficacy threshold.
All right, I want us to take our next question. Remember, you can stream us live on iView and join the conversation. Lots of opinions on this one. I know Quanda is the hashtag. Please do keep it nice if you are online. Our next question comes from Dennis Fitzgerald.
Seatbelts are compulsory because they've been proven to save lives. Why aren't vaccines compulsory?
Tony.
It's inappropriate to vaccinate somebody against their will if they make that decision. I think we should be encouraging people and relying on voluntary uptake. Now, there is a flip side to that. If you're the employer running an intensive care unit or an aged care facility, it's entirely appropriate at the institutional level to require that anybody working in that facility is vaccinated. But I think it's inappropriate to require individuals to be mandatorily vaccinated. That's going too far on the ethics of it from my point of view. I just want to come back to Mohammed's point here. It's inappropriate and unethical for a country like Australia to hog the vaccine. I think it's entirely appropriate for developing countries where we've got the high vaccine virus levels to be vaccinated first. And the second comment I'd make that I don't think came out is the one instance where we should probably have used emergency measures to get the vaccine in here earlier was to vaccinate our 80,000 people at the border, at the quarantine, because look what's happening now. If we'd vaccinated those people, we would have reduced the chance of the virus getting out. Not completely, but it would have been probably a good thing to do.
Sharon, do you think there's a case for making it mandatory, the vaccine?
I don't think there's a case for making it mandatory. I think what we need is really consistent, easy to understand information so that people actually understand the benefits of the vaccine, the safety of the vaccine, and what it can achieve if we achieve really high uptake of the vaccine. Do we have to vaccinate every single person in the country to have a major effect on saving lives and reducing transmission? No, but we have to get it up really high.
I just wanted to reassure everyone. Tony did make the comment that potentially at an institutional level, people might not be able to be aged care workers or nurses in intensive care units. I mean, as a senior administrator at Canberra Hospital, that is not the path that we would go down. That is not the recommendation from the Attorney General's Department, from an industrial relations perspective. We need to convince our healthcare workers just as much as the community at large that this is an effective vaccine and a safe vaccine. Like the community, we can't force anyone to take the vaccine.
There are people clearly conscious of consequences if they don't. I want to bring in Naeem Mellam, who's got a question. What is it?
Since we're discussing whether we should, the vaccine should be mandatory, what happens if I don't want to have it?
Yeah, will there be consequences, professional consequences, consequences in terms of your ability to travel, Nick Coatsworth?
Well, I don't think there's going to be professional consequences. I get a lot of people from large business organisations talking to me about this, and my response to them is always the same. This is about convincing your employees, just as we are convincing the community, that the vaccine is good for them, it's good for the business, it's going to enable them to travel, for our community to flourish. This is the way that we get people vaccinated. This is the way we've always got people to be vaccinated. We're a vaccination nation.
But we do
this
have
is
some
going to be
punitive
harder.
measures, though, in some circumstances. There's no jab, no play policies
We do.
in parts of Australia. There are examples where we do try and force people to have vaccines. Why not in this case?
Well, because I think it's a clearly different situation in a pandemic where
But isn't it more important now?
It is more important, but people have very legitimate concerns that we're hearing tonight. So it's even more important that we take the path of explaining, convincing, discussing, and being completely open and transparent about it with no punitive measures whatsoever, because that's what's going to get us the highest uptake, and that's what's going to be most protective for the Australian community.
All right, our next question comes from Donna Wyatt.
Hi, we've seen in the US the weaponisation and politicisation of mask wearing.
Might just get you to start that question again so our
Sure.
audience can hear.
We've seen in the US the weaponisation and politicisation of mask wearing. In Australia, politician Craig Kelly has raised questions about COVID treatments, including the use of hydroxychloroquine. Media personalities such as Pete Evans have raised questions about the efficacy of COVID vaccinations and vaccination programs more broadly. So my question to the panel is, in such a politically charged environment, what can be done to reach people who oppose the vaccination program, especially given that many anti-vaxxers are well educated and use research to justify their opposition?
Tony.
That's a big question. It's a difficult one. I agree with Nick here that you've got to do the education so that people come along with you. The Kellys of this world, thankfully in Australia, that's a very small part of our political pie, as it were. So at least we've got that position of strength there. I think countries like Australia, a bit more of a social democracy, have done better at not politicising the wearing of masks. See the way New South Wales took it up so quickly. So I don't think we've got as much of a problem there on the politicisation of it. As far as reaching out to anti-vaxxers, that's challenging. My approach to that is that you've got to be straight up. You've got to present those results from the international trials that show the side effects are low. But you also have to be open to the possibility that there will occasionally be side effects and sometimes serious side effects, and be honest about that and thoroughly investigate incidences when they happen. So just finishing up there, you know, it will happen that 10 days after somebody's vaccinated, they'll get an autoimmune disease or something like that, and there'll immediately be questions. In all likelihood, they were going to get it anyway. But you still need to take that seriously, investigate it, and then look for the evidence from all the trials across the world. That's how I would approach it.
Sharon Lewin,
can I
how
add one
troubled
thing?
have you, I just want to gauge how troubled you've been about the promotion or by the promotion of hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, I mean, you're just talking about the problems with misinformation and trying to, digest selective digestion of what's out there and making a very strong conclusion about the treatment. Well, Craig Kelly can't prescribe hydroxychloroquine, and you won't get a single doctor around the country that's going to do it, but it does spread misinformation and promote fixed beliefs. And I think we've got to, the government's got to put out clear and consistent communication, doctors and scientists do, but I really think for vaccination we need to embrace community leaders and people that can really influence and speak the same language as the very diverse group that we want to vaccinate.
And
I
just
think
today,
that's going to be very
in the
important.
JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine, hydroxychloroquine randomised trial, multiple countries around the world, no effect.
So what's the answer, though, when you have a public figure, like an elected politician, that's spruiking this stuff?
I think I just said it. No effect. Trials all around the world. And that's what the message we need to get out there.
But that's not going to shut up some people, and they have big
there'll
platforms
always
on
be
places
the one,
like
there'll always be the 1% like that.
Yeah.
And it's important that they see that 99% of us read the journals or convey that message. And the science says this, no effect of hydroxychloroquine.
Michelle, I think you were trying to get...
Yeah, I think these are great questions, and I think it's normal to be hesitant about vaccination, particularly for adults. It's different for littlies, right? We just make our kids do it and they don't have a choice. So what I would say, though, is just turn it around a little bit and say that delaying vaccination or avoiding vaccination could come with a heavy cost, right? It could come with a heavy cost to you, to your inner circle, whoever that is, and to the wider community. And, there are statistics around that, there are stories around that, there are narratives. So, you need to make a decision and weigh up what is actually in your interest and in the interest of your family, because often it's the emotional context that will motivate adults to do something. For example, if you were to come home and inadvertently infect your parents or your children or your spouse or partner, and they ended up in hospital on a ventilator or they died, you would feel the guilt, right, of that. And I think that that is not to be underestimated, because that's suffering as well. Even though you didn't get sick, you might have, breezed through COVID, but someone else has taken a hit.
Dr. Coatsworth, how do you get that message through to Paleo Pete?
Well, you don't. I mean, I honestly, I think...
You just give up on speaking to him?
I think you have to, because there are a certain group who are promoting this message who, it doesn't matter how many times I talk to them, they're not going to change. So what we have to do through shows like this, through the government advertising campaign, through direct conversation, is find the people who are seeking their information from Paleo Pete and divert them or bring them into the credible conversations, the credible news sources that we're putting out through health.gov.au. But also it's going to be word of mouth. It's going to be the successful vaccination rollout. It's going to be demonstrations of safety and effectiveness in our own community. That will build momentum of itself as well.
You're not going to get an invite on his podcast after saying all of that. No. Now, we've sort of started to stray into this territory now of vaccine hesitancy, not quite anti-vaxxers, and there is quite a bit of data out on this, but we've polled our studio audience tonight. The majority of you have responded. It is anonymous, though, I should say. Here's the results. So we've split you up into those that are going to take it immediately, want it straight away, those that say you won't get it at all, tiny fraction of you, 2%, and then 15% of you that say you are hesitant about this. You might wait a bit longer until you know more. That's actually better than some of the public polling on this sort of stuff. But we've got Jasper Kitschke in the audience tonight. You've got someone in your life that sounds like they're vaccine hesitant. Who is it and what are they saying?
So I was chatting to my mum the other day on the phone, and she expressed that she was a little bit hesitant about the vaccine, especially for someone in her age group as well. She's in her early 60s.
And did she explain why? Did she tell you where she's getting her information from?
I think, Mum watches the ABC, she reads a lot of the papers and she's up to date with the news, but I think it's just the sheer volume of news out there that it made it sort of, quite difficult, not to kind of have a bit of concern.
So confusion more than being opposed to the idea of it?
Yeah, more this idea of kind of waiting to see,
yeah.
Instead of the idea of, maybe being like a bit of a fence sitter for the moment. Which I imagine are a lot of people as well.
So I do want to get the panel's take, but did you try convincing your mum, or did you?
Yeah, I told my mum that I'd get the vaccine when it's available to me, instead of trying to reassure her that way.
Yeah.
Did
it work?
Well, I'd hope so. I guess we'll have to wait and see.
I hope Mum's watching tonight. Sharon Lewin, what do you do for Jasper's mum? How do you get someone across the line? Because clearly pretty well educated, engaged with the information that Nick is saying is key, yet still not convinced.
Well, I think number one, and Michelle alluded to this before, is recognising the concerns. It's entirely reasonable to have a bit of concern because this has all happened so fast, and in a year we've gone from a new virus to a vaccine. And so recognising the concern is really important. Second, I think the benefits of the vaccine to her are really important to emphasise. So people often do care what the benefit's going to be to her. Benefits to other people are also really important. And I think many vaccine hesitant people really change with more information and also trusted advice. So from friends of hers, I mean, she may think, well, you know, because you're much younger, it will be fine. But, you know, speaking to her friends can have a big impact, speaking to her doctor, who she might trust. And with a bit more time, she may feel very differently about that. And I just want to say about your poll is very interesting, because the figures you got from this room are almost exactly of the figures of vaccine hesitancy more broadly for all vaccines. But interestingly, when you, about 15% and about 2 or 3% that will never have vaccines, but the recent polls that have been in Australia have shown vaccine hesitancy of about 40%. So it's actually a much bigger number than what we're seeing here.
To speak to your point, Jasper, I can tell you what happened to me last week. My daughter came home from school and she was crook. She had a runny nose, sore throat, and she was feverish. And I swear, I just sat there and I thought, oh my God, she has COVID, because there's no flu, so it's got to be COVID. And, you know, we cancelled dinner plans. We got in the car and we got ourselves swabbed in the drive-thru. It was amazing. The whole experience was phenomenal. Thank you, Monash Wellington Road Screening Clinic. And essentially, you know, we had about 24, 48 hours of anxiety, right, in the house. And I was actually thinking to myself, I would have really liked that extra layer of protection, knowing that I had antibodies, meant that I wasn't going to get sick. I wasn't going to pass this on to anyone else in my family. And so, you know, it just sort of brought it home to me that when I'm offered a vaccine, I'm going to be taking the vaccine. As long as it is TGA approved, that's fine with me, because that is peace of mind.
So what I just want to understand, though, and help our audience understand, Tony, is whether these proportions allow us as a country to get on top of this. Because Sharon's saying that the target is not herd immunity, it's to avoid hospitalisation, avoid deaths. If these numbers that we saw here and are reflected in other polling were borne out in the rollout of this vaccine, would that solve our problem?
Yeah, so that's a herd immunity question. I'll come back to that briefly. Jasper, I get it. You're injecting something into your body that's doing something inside your body. It is a bit odd. And for the 15% of the population who don't want to do that, and immediately seeing how the rest of the population does it, learning from that, and then Sharon's point, that there's not only a benefit to you or to your mum, but also to the people around her, and those people will start to come on over. Which comes back to the point that you're raising, Hamish, about people coming on over. And that speaks to herd immunity. So whilst the government's goal is to try and stop people getting sick, what we really want is herd immunity. And we may or may not get to it. I'm actually more confident we'll
So they want it, they're just not saying that?
Sorry?
They want it, they're just not saying that?
Of course we want it.
Oh, no, I think the short-term goal is to protect and reduce deaths. But the long-term goal is to reduce transmission, and you do that through herd immunity.
And so with the AstraZeneca, it's reducing the chance that I will get it by about 50%. Now, the Moderna, which is a bit like the Pfizer, about 70% when you do the numbers. I won't explain exactly how it works here. But that's just a chance that I'll get it from you if you've got it and you're not vaccinated. But if you've been vaccinated and unfortunate enough to get infected, the duration that you're infected for and your infectivity will go down. And those numbers of total blocking of the transmission will go up. I believe go up in quite a virtuous cycle, so that herd immunity, I think, is still game on. Can't guarantee it. Don't want to have that come back at me in 6 months if we don't get there. But I think we can get there. But it does require Jasper's mum and at least, let's say, 75% of the population to be vaccinated to give us a good chance.
Okay. We're going to do something a bit different tonight because we've got so many questions from you, really practical questions. We're going to do a quick fire round of questions from our audience. And to kick it off, here's Sabrina Woodward. What's your question?
Hey guys, is the vaccine likely to be a once-off that fixes everything? Or with all the different mutations and variants, do you see it becoming something like the flu vax where you have to get a new one every year?
Sharon Lewin.
We don't know the answer to that now, but I would predict that we will likely have to have repeat vaccinations, and they may change each year, but it may not be forever.
And that's because of new strains?
It's because of new strains. We actually don't know how long the immunity will last for. We know that we get really good immunity from the vaccines, both AstraZeneca and Pfizer. You make antibodies and you can measure them. They don't decay over 2 months. We don't know if they last for 6 or 12 months and if you need a booster dose. We'll learn that. We'll know that the answer to that soon.
OK, also for you, Sharon, this is from Tess Wilson in Lightview, South Australia. The rollout can coincide with when we normally get the flu vax. Can I get them at the same time? How do the two vaccines interact?
Yeah, the recommendation is not to get them at the same time. That's largely because we just don't know enough about the two of them together, and to separate the flu vaccine and the COVID vaccine by 2 weeks. And that recommendation comes from how some of the big studies were designed.
OK, Nick, this is for you from Hyab in South Yarra. Will access to different types of vaccines be up to the patient, or will there be a you get what's available system? Basically, can you choose AstraZeneca or Pfizer?
Well, at the moment, there's only one approved and it's going to be rolled out, and that's Pfizer.
But longer term?
When AstraZeneca comes online, it will really depend. It's more where you are in the queue and then what vaccine is there on the day. Of course, you have the option of saying, I don't want that vaccine, but that will not likely mean someone's going to go out the back and get the other one and give that to you.
Okay.
In the short term. In the longer term, and we're talking towards the end of this year into 2022, there will be a variety of vaccines.
From Eric Jeffries, also for you from Queensland, what's the time between getting your jab and when immunity kicks in?
Well, that's going to vary from person to person, but the most important thing at the moment with the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccine is you absolutely get the second dose when you need it to, because it's the second dose that really gets you to the antibody levels that you need for protection.
OK, and Michelle Anandaraja from Margaret Bain in Macclesfield, Victoria. She says, my cousin in England had problems after her COVID injection, a swollen tongue, muscle pains and off balance. Might we have reactions to the injection in Australia too?
Yeah, so that's referring to anaphylaxis, which has been described with the Pfizer vaccine. So just to put things into perspective, the incidence is really low still. It's 11 per million doses. And essentially, again, they've dispensed 1.9 million. There was a report that was put out. 20 people got anaphylaxis. 17 of those people actually had a history of allergy. So you're more likely to get anaphylaxis if you have a history of some type of allergy. The important thing here is that they were all fine in the end. They had to hang around for about 15 minutes. Most of these things happen in 15 minutes. They're given adrenaline and they're fine. So this is not a reason to avoid having the vaccine. The important thing is to just check the ingredient list and make sure you're not allergic to any of those components.
Nick, can we just be clear with our audience tonight? What are the side effects of the vaccines that we'll be getting in Australia?
Well, the side effects are very similar to some existing vaccines that we've got. The most common one is fatigue the day after, but you can also get pain at the injection site. You can get people have reported dizziness, people have reported fever, and people have reported just not feeling themselves. And most of the time, that's about 1 in 10. And all of those symptoms have been controlled in the major studies with paracetamol, and they resolve in 24 to 48 hours.
OK. All right, let's take our next question. It comes from Fiona Bruce in the studio.
I'm a doctor in Melbourne. Vaccinations alone are not going to be enough. We still clearly have issues with hotel quarantine. We need input from occupational hygienists, aerosol experts and ventilation engineers. Why is there not national guidance which accepts the reality that airborne transmission is an important mode of spread for this virus and adopts the precautionary principle to protect workers from the airborne spread of this virus with fit-tested N95 masks and other measures?
Tony Blakely.
I agree. But there's been a kick in the pants in the last couple of days whereby we've seen the aerosolisation for a nebuliser. We've seen it in the Park Royal, I think it was, where it went from one room to the corridor to the next room. You cannot deny that aerosol transmission is happening. So that has to now be history. And therefore we need to be doing, sure, N95 masks, but they're not that comfortable to wear. So we need to think about the whole hierarchy of controls you can put in quarantine. Pick a hotel that's got plenty of space. Find a hotel that's got the ventilation such that there's a 10 times per hour turnover of the air in it. All those sorts of things to get the ventilation going. Take the security guards off the corridor if you've got CCTV. And then, yes, those protective things for the workers in there and the staff, like the mask, the goggles, all the rest of it when they are going to the door of those hotel rooms. It's a whole cascade of events. Whether you could make everybody in a hotel wear an N95 mask if they're not in close proximity to somebody, that might be asking too much because they are somewhat uncomfortable to wear. But I completely agree with you. It's time for federal guidance around aerosol and its impact in quarantine. And we need three things with quarantine. First, get as much of it as we can out to the regional places like Howard Springs, where it's my textbooks in public health medicine said that's how you do it before COVID. CBD hotels, which we're going to have to keep using for a while because we've got limited capacity. They need to be improved through the measures I've talked about, and vaccinate the staff in those quarantine facilities as quickly as possible. But I agree with your sentiment.
Nick Coatsworth.
I mean, I think one of the things we've got to be very clear on is that it has been recognised since day zero of the pandemic that aerosols can be generated, and there wasn't really a hospital in the country that would have used a nebuliser in its emergency department after the pandemic was declared. So that is something that's been known, and known for the past 12 months. There is a live debate about the extent to which COVID-19 is transmitted via the aerosol route, via aerosols of COVID-19 that are inhaled.
But you're shaking your head furiously at this,
but we're just, I'm almost done. We just need to look at the numbers for hotel quarantine, the most successful program in the world. 250,000 Australians returned through hotel quarantine. 3,000 people had COVID-19 in hotel quarantine, and a handful of breakthroughs, which we are learning from every time. And we're in a cycle of continuous improvement where the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee is looking at every single case and looking at the controls that Tony's described.
And announced it today where AHPPC each week is going to start their meeting off on this very question, which is great. However, one point, Nick, is as the droplets we controlled easier because that was 1.5 metres. So the spread that's happening in hotels and other places due to droplets is probably very low now. And that means the remaining transmission is probably more aerosol-based, and even more so now with the more transmissible variants coming in. So it's an emerging problem for us that we need to address. I agree with you, actually, that hotel quarantines work pretty well. The problem here is that if one virus gets out and starts another Melbourne second wave, that's a big problem.
There's no debate. There has been clear and compelling evidence from the start of this pandemic. In fact, the Chinese, from the get-go, basically acknowledged that this was aerosol transmission by far, and it was based on their own experience with SARS.
So Nick Coatsworth's wrong?
Yes. Yes, and I've published on this, so it's all good.
I think Nick said there was aerosol spray, and that's why we're all wearing masks. So there isn't really a big debate.
I'm taking issue on this, that it's a debate, and we're 14 months into this, and we've had real lack of movement on acknowledging the fundamentals of disease transmission. So if you don't acknowledge that this is spread through the air through a mixture of droplets as well as aerosols, it's a continuum. You can't really slice what a droplet is and what an aerosol is. It's kind of a spectrum. If you can't even acknowledge that, then you can't prevent it. And I can speak about this because I'm a healthcare worker, right? I'm a doctor. I see patients in emergency. I see patients on the wards. And for the first 6 months of last year, it was scary. It was scary. We were getting surgical masks and we were told that that's all you're going to get. And of course, the second wave came into Victoria and healthcare workers started falling like flies. All right, so we had accelerating infections in multiple hospitals as that second wave took out. And in the end, we had 4,100 healthcare workers who were infected. And it took hundreds and hundreds of healthcare workers to get infected for hospitals to then introduce N95 respirators. And fit testing is something I campaigned with along with some colleagues. And, we have now got fit testing. It took till September for that to come in, and I got my fit test done last week. So I'm grateful, but it's not exactly an A+.
I think we probably have to acknowledge, though, that it's only really a debate from the side that thinks that people like me didn't acknowledge aerosol transmission. Now, I'm also a doctor. I'm a respiratory trained infectious disease physician. My wife's a respiratory physician. She does aerosol generating procedures all the time. I agree with every single thing that Michelle said. It is a continuum. There is an element of airborne transmission. There's actually no disagreement here. So what we need to move on to now is getting out there and getting our healthcare workers vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine and then the AstraZeneca vaccine, so that our healthcare system is actually overburdened overburdened in the way that other healthcare systems have been overburdened.
Just to bring it back to the question of the vaccine, which is what we're here to talk about tonight, is there a threat if the South African strain becomes a problem in Australia that this will get ahead of us? Because in effect, we are in a fortress in Australia through the hotel quarantine system. If we're now saying that things are changing such that it's different to what it was when we first began, and although it worked very well for a time, do we actually need to be reassessing whether what we're doing in hotel quarantine works now for the current conditions?
We are reassessing it. Tony mentioned it, I mentioned it, the AHPPC, the chief health officers are reassessing it all the time. But we can't, this South African variant and what we do with our vaccination policy, the World Health Organisation came out today and emphasised that the AstraZeneca vaccine can and should be rolled out for adults over the age of 16. South Africa will be using the AstraZeneca vaccine. I'm sure our regulator is going to be talking to the South African
Nick, you don't know
regulator
that.
to
Hang on,
discuss
South
that.
Africa have actually paused rollout of the AstraZeneca. I haven't heard that they're
South
actually
Africa are
using
actually using the AstraZeneca vaccine. They're going to follow the 100,000 people that next get it. Salim Abdul
Within the context of a trial.
Salim Abdul Karim, who's leading that trial, who I know extremely well, will be looking closely at what the effect will be on the 100,000. At the same time, they'll start using Johnson & Johnson. But South Africa are in the middle of a major pandemic with 85% of their strains being South African variant and thousands of people dying a day. So they're going to get the answers on that. And I think what we've got to be have to come to terms with here is the changing information we're going to get. You know, coronavirus is an RNA virus. It will mutate. It hasn't mutated because of vaccines. I just want to clarify that, because there hasn't been enough. This all appeared before vaccines. And I should say the other major mutation that we've seen far more in Australia is the one that originated in the UK, and we're not seeing any issues with that one, with the vaccine in preliminary.
Yeah, but the UK variant has actually also picked up a particular mutation which is found on the South African variant. This goes back to my earlier point, which is that all these variants are essentially figuring out how to become more contagious, and
virology 101.
Right,
yeah.
and try to evade vaccines. So what I'm saying here is that we have signals coming from clinical trials, Novavax, Johnson & Johnson, and now AstraZeneca, that there may be a problem with the vaccines because they were essentially developed using the original strain, right? But now this has mutated again, and I think we need to stay ahead of the game as a country, because there is every possibility that the AstraZeneca vaccine will be rolled out to 10 million adults, and we may still end up being vulnerable when we relax our international borders and allow people in, because the variants will come in. So, and I feel that is a population level experiment which has high stakes attached to it, and personally, I'm not comfortable with that approach at all.
Look, let's cut to the chase here. So I think Australia did an amazing job 6 months ago at backing a range of vaccines, and it would be hypocritical to criticise that now. We've got enough of the Pfizer to do most of our first phase of people. Let's get that done. We can then reassess what's happening at that point as to whether then we then bring in the AstraZeneca for the next tranche of people. We've got some time. Let's get the Pfizer rolled out and then we can reassess. At that point, there'll be a decision to be made as to whether the AstraZeneca is still covering enough or not. And if it's on the borderline and we use the AstraZeneca, and I'm the one who gets an AstraZeneca and I need to have another dose next year because it gets updated to cover the next virus wave, the next lot of mutations, that's fine.
But then, Tony, why not just start with a highly efficacious vaccine from the beginning? How about we start with Pfizer or Moderna or Novavax?
But every country's asking that question. That comes right back to Mohammed's question right at the beginning, is if we've got limited mRNA vaccines of high efficacy and other countries are screaming out for them, I think it's not a bad thing.
It's not just mRNA though. So here's the deal.
Just so our audience is clear, you're talking about Pfizer
and Moderna.
Yeah, Pfizer and Moderna.
So Pfizer just yesterday or the day before announced that they have slashed their vaccine batch production from 110 days down to 60. They also announced, and this was on an investor call, right? So this is reliable, credible evidence that they were going to be delivering 200 million doses to the US 2 months ahead of schedule.
Fantastic.
So that is fantastic for the United States. But what I'm saying is that this does not sound like a company that is struggling with supply.
But we don't need to decide that tonight or tomorrow. Let's roll out the Pfizer doses we've got, and as we're getting to the point where we need to be deciding what we need to actually use in the next tranche, we can pivot away from AstraZeneca or stay with AstraZeneca.
Okay, that's a great idea. That's what I've been saying.
Can I sort of bring it back to the principles here? Because I'm getting a bit bloody confused, to be honest, and I think if I am, we probably all are. We've got to come back to the objectives of this vaccination program, and that is that we want to prevent severe disease and death. We want to stop our ICUs being overwhelmed. We want to protect our most vulnerable people, and we can do it with the vaccines we've got. And most importantly, we can do it with a vaccine that we're producing on our own shores, which is the AstraZeneca vaccine. Tony's absolutely right. I will likely get the Astra vaccine. You'll likely get the Astra vaccine.
Which is fine, it's great.
We are likely to get another vaccine in 2022 as well. But let's use the vaccines that we've purchased. They do stop severe disease. We will get Novavax. We will have access to other vaccines like the Janssen vaccine down the track. This debate about the variants and looking at every study every day, like it's just going to become confusing for the public, and it needn't be. We're going to have a safe, effective vaccination campaign.
So to that point then, Sharon Lewin, do we face a particularly unique set of circumstances in that the virus is evolving as they do, the science is evolving very quickly as well? You're all saying we've got to question it, we've got to make sure we test everything and look at everything constantly. At the same time, you have a public that wants very clear, simple answers and certainty. So does this pose a problem in that we've got to be actively curious and sceptical to some degree about the science, whilst also accepting what Nick says, it's all going to be okay?
Well, in brief, I think it's all going to be okay. We've got 2 vaccines that are highly effective, and it's an actual medical miracle that we've got those vaccines in under a year. It's extraordinary, and know that they're safe. And I think we also need to recognise that Australia's in a fabulous position, but winter is coming, and we're in a, and winter is coming, and we know that coronavirus likes spreading in winter. So we really shouldn't keep waiting. We've got these 2 vaccines now. We know from big studies and from real-world evidence of rolling them out, they work. We will have Pfizer vaccine at the beginning, but the Pfizer vaccine will come in over 12 months, so we're not going to get those 20 million doses up front. So I think using 2 is completely fine, and that over time we will have other vaccines, as Nick just said. We will have the Novavax vaccine. We will have new iterations of both Pfizer and AstraZeneca. So I think we have to sort of focus on what we're trying to achieve here, stopping hospitals get overrun and getting a large percentage of people vaccinated as we come up to winter.
But Australia has been, really well shielded from, those kinds of losses of, hospitalisations and deaths relatively. It hasn't been smooth sailing, I agree. But, so I think what I'm hearing from my own patients and from some of my colleagues is they're asking me, they'd like the Pfizer vaccine. They understand that there is a difference between an efficacy of 95% and an efficacy of 63%. Okay, it just means you're going to get fewer breakthrough infections, right? 5% versus 40%. There is a significant difference here, and I feel that the Australian public are not being levelled with. And this speaks to this issue of equity. Australia's approach is a hybridised approach where 10 million adults will be getting a highly efficacious vaccine in Pfizer, safe. The other 10 million will be getting a safe vaccine, which is moderately efficacious in AstraZeneca. And what I can't reconcile...
Is it fair to say the public's not being levelled with? I mean, the government, folks like Nick are turning up and answering every single question that's put.
Right, but when I hear messaging like they're highly effective vaccines, that's not correct. There is a highly effective vaccine in Pfizer, Moderna, Novavax, and there is a moderately efficacious vaccine in AstraZeneca. So there is nuance here, and I think that that needs to be conveyed to the Australian people because, honestly, we are moving now towards recovery. We are looking to open up. We want to do that safely. We want to open up our borders, bring in tourists, travel, commerce, trade. The fundamentals are that we have been on life support in a holding pattern, right, for the last 14 months, but we now need to bring Australia back, get her off life support and get her flourishing again. So, that confidence will come with the most efficacious vaccines for the population, not just for half the population, but for all of them.
Only if we diminish confidence in the actual program. I mean, I think what we've got to be very careful of, and as I said this at the start, is diminishing the confidence in the program by misquoting the evidence about efficacy of the vaccine, that is stopping you getting COVID-19 and stopping you getting severe disease. All of the vaccines stop you from getting severe disease. That alone will allow our community to flourish. You can have a vaccine that's 100% effective. If no one's getting it, your vaccination program is 0% effective. So we need to use the vaccines we've got at the moment. We need to roll them out to as many Australians as we can, and that will actually give us the most successful outcome from this vaccination program.
But Nick, can we not then pivot to Novavax, for example? I mean, this is a vaccine with some really encouraging preliminary data. It's looking like it's 89%, right, based on a clinical trial, 15,000 people, 3 continents. And CSL can manufacture it. So why couldn't we pivot to that? And we have a pre-order with Novavax.
So I think it's a really, really good question. The Novavax is in its latter stages of its phase 3 trials. It needs to be approved by the regulator. CSL's actually making AstraZeneca, not Novavax at the moment. And I don't know what it was like here in July last year and August last year. It was bad. I can't feel how bad it was because I wasn't here. So I'm not going to, as someone who advises the government on public policy, sit here in the knowledge that I have vaccine but not give it to the people of Victoria because I'm waiting for something that I don't personally think is more effective. I don't want to put Victorians or anyone in Australia in that sort of risk. We have a vaccine that will protect us from what happened in Victoria last year. It's Pfizer, it's AstraZeneca, and we're going to use them.
Okay, let's take our next question. It comes from Blake Leshen.
Thanks, Hamish. The pandemic has made us acutely aware of how interlinked we are globally and that we are only as strong as our weakest link. Given this, is Australia doing enough to ensure our regional neighbours have the support and infrastructure to vaccinate their populations?
Sharon Nguyen.
Really, really important question. We really need the whole world vaccinated, not just wealthy countries that can vaccinate all of their populations. So at the moment, the Australian government is supporting a investment in vaccines for the region through Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, that $500 million that will go towards vaccines. In addition, we're also supporting COVAX. So COVAX is an international network that is purchasing vaccines. Australian government's contributed, I think, $80 million to that. Then they distribute it to low and middle income countries. Having said that, at the moment, an overwhelming amount of vaccine is going to high income countries. So we need to advocate even stronger and harder for access. And it's not even just getting the vaccines into the country. The delivery system is really complex. The vaccine that we're talking about, Pfizer, is super complex because you need ultra cold storage. That's probably not even an option because of the issues with delivery. But we need to really strengthen the capacity to actually implement them. And that's what the Australian government's looking at, primarily in the Pacific, I think, as well as some countries in Asia.
Tony Blakely, if that's the case, why then does Australia have 3 times as much vaccine as we need? That's what the Health Minister, Greg Hunt, says.
It's options on those vaccines, and those vaccines can be dispersed elsewhere. And this all, again, comes back to...
Will they be?
Well, they'll have to be, because you can't use up 3 times as much in the first year at least, maybe over a longer period. But this comes back right to Mohammed's point, and another point here, is that we are global citizens. And we're in the fortress here, we're doing really well. And if we need to slow down our vaccination program because our neighbours need some of that vaccine, that's okay. We're part of a global community here. We have these responsibilities. It's not just the right thing to do, it's actually in light and self-interest. It's a lot cheaper than building a Belt and Road initiative to actually give countries vaccine and build that trust up with your neighbours. thinking about what's happening in the region at the moment. So there are enlightened self-interest reasons why we would want to be helping our countries around us in the Western Pacific region, as well as it being just the right thing. And if it means we need to slow down, that's fine, because we're doing quite well here.
Nick Coatsworth, you're the former head of MSF in Australia. We talk a lot about the Pacific and helping the Pacific. There's a country just to our north with quite a few 100 million people, Médecins Sans Frontières, I should clarify for those that don't know. There's a very big country just to our north. Are we helping Indonesia?
Well, Indonesia's been a partner for Australia for a long time, and it is actually the Indo-Pacific Health Security Initiative, which is the aegis under which our regional vaccine program is being done. There's a huge amount of money here. I found out today it's $500 million and $200 million is going towards vaccines. Particularly in the Pacific, we're actually going to assist not just with vaccines, we're going to top up the COVAX facility, which is the sort of international facility to disperse vaccines around the world. We'll give 20%, but we're going to do it for Pacific neighbours, but we're going to top up that with millions of doses of vaccine. And then from the Indonesian perspective, you know, and my experience with MSF, it's about the nations asking for assistance as well, rather than it just being offered. So, of course, that assistance will be available to the Indonesian government. I'm not aware of what's been asked for at the moment.
If we assume that Australia gets it completely right with the vaccine rollout, but our neighbours don't, the region doesn't get it right, what does that mean for us?
Well, I think if we get it right, we're going to export how we got it right to the region. And I mean...
But are we necessarily safe if our neighbours aren't safe?
Well, what we'll be safe from is severe disease, our hospitals being overwhelmed and our healthcare workers and aged care residents actually succumbing to the virus. That's what we'll be safe from. But I'm very confident, I really am, that the health programs out in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, if we find the special sauce and get this right, then that's going to be exported straight away.
That's the optimistic outlook, though. What happens if it isn't so rosy for the
Well,
region?
I think if we can't vaccinate a really large number of the whole world, the issues around travel, we will not be as free as, we will not be able to travel in the same way. We will still have the issue of quarantine and the risk of imported infections. So we really do need to support those countries, and also the impact of COVID in those countries. At the moment, the Pacific's been relatively spared, and many countries in Southeast Asia have also done reasonably well, but the impacts are incredible on their health system.
How long do you think we'll be living with quarantine arrangements for?
I think we're going to have quarantine arrangements for quite some time, because even with quarantine will at least be for another 12 months, and maybe over the next 12 to 24 months we might see some variation in quarantine, meaning a hybrid system where you might stratify on risk depending on where you've been, and a mix of home and hotel quarantine. I do think quarantine will look different in 12 months as we vaccinate more Australians and as many more visitors are vaccinated. But it won't eliminate the risk of bringing the virus.
And how about domestic borders opening and shutting?
Domestic borders opening and shutting, well, that's another story. I'm hoping we will see greater consistency in what
I think this is a really important point.
Sorry?
I think it's a really important point about domestic borders, because, you know, as you know, the custodians of public health are our state governments, right? And it's not clear to me that, you know, if we're going to be having breakthrough infections, what does that actually mean in terms of border closures? Are we still going to have these snap border closures? What is the level of tolerance amongst our state premiers for COVID? And, you know, a really interesting observation over the last 12 months, we've seen them basically pivot from flattening the curve to essentially elimination. They have got no appetite for COVID. And as a result of that, we have no appetite for COVID. So Australians have become accustomed to living freely without COVID, and that's essentially because of this zero tolerance approach. And so I feel like, you know, if we are being told to take up a moderately efficacious vaccine in the AstraZeneca, yes, I agree, it will keep us out of hospital and save lives, but is that really in line with community expectations?
We're going to have to wrap this up. Final thought to you, Nick Coatsworth. How much longer will we be living with opening and closing domestic borders, do you reckon?
You said I was an optimist, Hamish, I am. And I actually think the more data we get from the hundreds of millions of people and our own community getting vaccinated, that's going to very much change our own view as a community. It's going to change premiers and chief health officers' views. And I would say the opening and shutting ends this year.
Okay. Before we go, a nice postscript to last week's episode with Australian of the Year and sexual abuse survivor Grace Tame. Who could forget her? You might remember Susan Decker, who sent a video for Grace sharing her own story. Well, this week, her daughter Brooke has been in touch.
Hi Q&A. My mother Susan Decker sent a video in last week for Grace Tame. What she didn't say in that video is that up until last week, when she told the whole nation that she was a survivor of sexual abuse, she'd hardly told a soul in her whole life. She didn't tell my siblings and I growing up, and she didn't tell our dad. Grace helped my mum find her voice and stand up and share her story so that others feel less alone. That's the power of Grace Tame's message, and that's how important this work is. It's never too late to find your voice. I'm so proud of you, Susie. Thank you, babe.
I'm not crying, you're crying. Wonderful way to end the show. That's all we've got time for tonight. A huge thanks to our terrific panel, Nick Coatsworth, Michelle Ananda-Rajah, Sharon Lewin and Tony Blakely. Please thank all of them. Next Thursday night, can we all live without Google? The Communications Minister, Paul Fletcher, Labor's Michelle Rowland and eSafety Commissioner Julie Inman-Grant will be here to discuss breaking up with big tech. Good night.